From my right, your left, Steve Anderson, ITV's Controller of News, Current Affairs, Arts and Religion. Nicola Merrick, Editor, Home Current Affairs Radio in the BBC's Current Affairs Department. On my left, your right, Professor Brian Winston, Dean of Media and Humanities at the University of Lincoln, and Paul Woolwich, Senior Executive Producer for BBC Television. I thought the great thing about Jeremy Isaacs' opening address last night was his wonderful enthusiasm for the whole thing. He's now a knight. He's, in my view, I think many people's view is he should have been knighted for his services to television, not for services to the opera. He reminded me again of why we're all here now, that we all, in one way or another, whether practitioners or academics, care about current affairs and think it's very, very important to the world we live in and to the democratic process. I'm sure when we come to consider the state we're in this morning, we'll want to think about different aspects of current affairs. We'll want to think about the content. Are we now a dumbed-down version of what was? Are we all celebrities? We'll want to think about style. How do we do it now? Do we do it very differently? Do we do it by means of reports? Is it much more observational? Do we have celebrity presenters as the only way we think we can persuade people to get interested? We'll want to look at scheduling. Where is current affairs shown? And we'll want to look at quantity, how much there is. And in that respect, we've got some useful research from Bournemouth here this morning, and at some point in the morning I'm going to ask Pat Holland, who's worked on that, just to give us the gist of what she's concluded. Three of the people on the table here are actively involved in making current affairs and other kinds of factual programs, and that's as it should be. We want to hear about the state we're in, not the state we were in. At the same time, I think we'll learn more about what we're doing now if we first recall a little bit about how we got here. So to kick us off, I'll get us to start, I think, in the right way. I'm going to ask Professor Winston to begin. Now, Brown is an academic, a journalist, a documentary filmmaker and writer. He's worked on Granada's World in Action, on BBC's 24 Hours, and as an independent documentary filmmaker in both Britain and America. He's a governor of the British Film Institute, and as it was governor of the British Film Institute, and I think you're still on some of its committees. So is that it? Yes. And as an educationalist, he's taught at the National Film and Television School of Great Britain and at Glasgow and Cardiff Universities. He's now Dean of Media and Humanities at the University of Lincoln. Brian, if you'll give us 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, I was a governor. You get to a point in life, don't you, where you're saying you were various things, right? I'm in that phase, and I have to say that I have to sort of disagree rather fundamentally with Jeremy's, I thought, slightly romanticised tale of heroic dare-do from his and indeed my generation. I was 5 years after him into the hands of Tim Hewitt at World in Action, and in fact the first show that I worked on is the one. It's in the little archive that you can go and view on Southern Africa, which opened the second season of World in Action in 1963. I don't think it was particularly a golden age. It was as much or as little a golden age as any other, and I think that you could almost paraphrase Barnum, really, that nobody's broadcasting career ever suffered by putting lots of elderly white chaps in a studio talking to each other. And I was going to say that about this panel, but I forgot that Nicola was here, so so we make some progress, right? But I think what I was thinking of was that Reith actually managed to kosher the deal for the rather curious foundational process of the BBC in the mid-20s by making sure that the great and the good made a regular progress through the studios in order to win their good opinions. And I think that the most recent career I would point to as benefiting from this technique would be my Lord Bert's. I personally found, and I know at least one other member of the audience found Weekend World impossible to watch, really, exactly for this reason. So I think there's a certain amount of nostalgia and misunderstanding about it, which we ought to get rid of. Let me say, as Tim would have said in 1963, writing World in Action scripts, consider these facts. I think that it is a fact that we were very much at World in Action, at least. I mean, last night I was told that our golden age was full of boring turgid programmes, and I was prepared to admit that This Week and Panorama were, but I would refuse to believe that World in Action was. World in Action was driven by stunts and by a desire to dumb down with the best of them, and I think it's absolutely absurd to claim that we weren't. I mean, when Tim wanted to do how stretched our resources were around the world militarily, we took a pine wood floor stage, we painted a map of the world, and I was required as a young researcher to find 16,000 plastic soldiers to put all over them. I mean, you know, we tried to enliven a show about the Daily Mirror Group by rolling a newsprint roll down the side of the Holborn Tower when it still existed. I mean, you know, come on, get real. We had the same sort of objectives, and I don't think we necessarily made a particularly good fist of doing them. I mean, Tim was beyond hostile to the pictorial. I mean, his favourite shot in any World in Action that he did in those first couple of years was after the Kennedy assassination, and he rushed off and came back with the latest speech he could find of Lyndon Johnson, who none of us knew at all. And it was a graduation speech, commencement exercises at University of Texas. And he just ran 25 minutes of it. But he had to make a cut. So he loved this. He found a cutaway of a wheel of a plane descending onto the tarmac and wrote the immortal line, and then he went to Latin America, right? I mean, that's how we made programs, you know, so it's not, you know, there is another way of looking at the history, right? And also in terms of content, I have to say this, Des Wilcox and Man Alive, etc., I think many of us, I don't know whether there are folks in the room who would agree with this, but my sense was that, you know, the worst excesses of the yellow press, tabloidese, were imported by Des into Man Alive. And he did all the sex and nonsense stuff, obviously within terms of the inhibitions of the time, with the best of them, frankly. And the notion that we weren't in the business of making news, rather, you know, we were purely just commenting on it or whatever, I find quite extraordinary. I mean, we were never more delighted, and I'm sure it was true of the other teams at the time, when we actually did make the news. So I think there's another way of looking at this history, frankly. And I think that speaks to the subject of this conference, which, with respect to Roger, is actually, of course, wrong. I mean, the endangered species, of course it's everything's an endangered species. I think few of the species, the genres of television, ought to be more endangered than current affairs, because it is actually to revert to that other aspect of the 60s that folks aren't talking about, i.e. the left-wing criticism that was emanating from such well-known bomb throwers as my Lord MacDonald of Tradeston and others. We really felt there was a powerful and indeed unacceptable ideological point being made by the distinction between news and current affairs, which was that current affairs was full of loonies and could be opinionated, etc., and therefore the news wasn't, right? The news was pure and objective, which some of us felt was not entirely acceptable. So I think there was another context. The beginnings of this absurd division were, of course, in the 20s and in the business of the hostility of the newspaper industry in this country, and as Doug will attest, I'm sure, in America too, to the business of radio, and the fact that the BBC was first of all forbidden bulletins and then restricted in when it could do bulletins, etc., and came up with a brilliant idea of talk.